Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with a very special episode of From the Editor's Desk. As always, joined by Kyle Brasseur. But this is either a retrospective, a remembrance, a look back, but I'm going to call it a celebration because Kyle has publicly announced his retirement from Compliance Week. And I asked him if he might come on and talk about his experience coming to compliance, working at Compliance Week, stepping into some very big shoes to become the editor in chief, and maybe a hint of some sports that we might be interested in. So, Kyle, first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to do this episode with me.
Oh no, Tom, it's my pleasure, and you're right. We just can't not talk about sport, man. We should help ourselves. But I really appreciate the opportunity to sort of look back on these last 5.5 years of Compliance Week, and I want to start with the very beginning, just to say, everyone, my first assignment at Compliance Week in 2018 was editing a Tom Fox podcast. So this is the only appropriate way for me to wrap up, is to be on a Tom Fox podcast.
Before you were given that assignment, how did you get to Compliance Week from your prior life in the sports journalism world?
I heard this, he needed someone to edit the Tom Fox podcast. That's what I had to jump at the chance. No, it's funny. I think, like a lot of people, you kind of just, it's a happy accident to sort of end up in a compliance related role. It's maybe not exactly what you had intended, but then once you're in it, you really start to really appreciate that opportunity and everything that the role brings to it. And so for myself, I mean, it's a little different as a journalist, but I had spent my first 5 years out of college doing sports journalism. And really, that was what I wanted to do. I went to school, wanted to be a sports journalist, and I had such incredible experiences in that role. But as I got older and lifestyle kind of caught up with me, sports journalism is a lot of late night. It's a lot of weekends. It's a lot of holidays. I got to a point in life where those things just weren't as acceptable. And so I looked to pivot toward something that could put me in more of a traditional 9 to 5 role. And it just so happened that one of my former editors, the previous editor-in-chief before me at Compliance Week, Dave Leifert, was looking to hire for a digital editor role at Compliance Week. He was just looking for someone to help with building a new website for Compliance Week. And he knew my skill set and knew what I could bring to it. And so he had reached out to me about the opening. And like many people, I probably didn't know 100% what compliance was. And I just said, okay, I can build a website and I can figure the rest out. And it ended up being that sort of thing where when I was in the role, I started to find just how much of the day-to-day news and interesting things had compliance implications to them. At that time, GDPR was all the rage, and that's all we were talking about. And data privacy was such an important part of the conversation in 2018. And I really started to understand just how important this work is and really got excited about it, maybe coming in not quite knowing it. And it was just, I felt like the right place to be.
I'm certainly glad you decided it was the right place to be. How did you professionally grow as a journalist? I've heard you tell the story about your growth in sports journalism, but starting from that prestigious role of editing a Tom Fox podcast, how did you learn the kind of business of compliance and how were you able to grow professionally from that experience?
I peaked day one, Tom. And how can you top that? I mean, for myself, what I really liked about Compliance Week and what drew me to the role is my previous experience in sports journalism was at very large outlets, ESPN, and I worked for a sports wire service that was called Field Level Media, where we had a lot of stringers and freelancers. And so it was really kind of hard to stand out. And whereas the edit team at Compliance Week, we always joke we're like a compliance department in that we are under-resourced for the job that we're trying to do. It was just such a smaller team and a smaller environment. But with that comes a lot of opportunities, just because things are so small, as that all hands on deck mentality toward everything. And as a relatively younger journalist at that time, I loved and I was really fascinated by the opportunity to just try new things. And I think that was one of the greatest things that Dave was able to offer me, was that environment to do that. And let's take a run at leading social media or leading our data analytics for traffic, website traffic, and everything like that. All these things that I would have never been able to sniff at a company like ESPN because they have dedicated people toward that, I got to be able to do. And, in these later years, it's been a little bit more of speaking and publicly at events and on other forums and all these other things that I really enjoyed these experiences of being able to sort of round out my journalism skill set, but also just find new things that I like and new things that maybe aren't for me, especially as I sort of consider my long-term career aspect and everything like that. It was really great to just have carte blanche, so to speak, and just be able to say, this is what I'm going to try and do today, because at the end of the day, the only way you're going to learn is through trial and error on a lot of these things.
So, Kyle, why is it so important to have journalists focusing on compliance, even within the context of a greater business journal cadre?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about, it's a niche audience. I mean, and it was such a drastic change coming from ESPN, where, I mean, your articles are being read by millions a day or whatever it might be, to really hyper focusing on one individual element of a company that's still relatively nascent. But it's important because you have to understand the nuance. And it took me a long time to get there. And the last, I would say probably 1 year in is when I felt comfortable writing about a lot of these topics, and 2 years in is when I felt confident about writing a lot of these topics, and doing so in a way that I felt really kind of addressed what were the issues that were top of mind to compliance officers, or understanding, seeing a news item and understanding this is what is the important compliance aspect of this. And it just takes time. It takes a dedication. If you're doing things at surface level, or you're trying to do things with a broad brush, you're never going to get that nugget, that piece of information that's really going to prove crucial for compliance officers to understand, or really kind of reflective of what they're actually facing in their jobs. And I think it's just, you have to go that niche if you're going to cater to a niche audience, because at the end of the day, if you're writing for that audience and they're reading the piece and they're not getting what they want out of it, they're not going to come back.
Kyle, you've touched upon some of the factors, but I wanted to ask directly, what are the differences, or at least the main differences, between sports journalism and compliance journalism?
It's funny, when I was at ESPN, we were always told to write for an eighth grader. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do that with a compliance audience. Both people have law degrees and are way smarter than me. It was helpful to kind of be able to expand my lexicon. I'll flex a little bit of a nice word there. But yeah, honestly, it's funny how many actual similarities there were. With sports writing, you want to be able to make something exciting and engaging. And I mean, it's crazy to say that's what you want to do with compliance, but that's the way compliance officers feel about their jobs. But it might be boring to a lot of people, but they're very passionate about their roles, and they get excited to be among their peers. And so you have to be able to reflect that in the writing. And I mean, it's not just Scuba and an enforcement action write up, but when I'm writing a column, or I'm writing a feature, or something that's kind of touching on the soft skills of the subject, I want it to be a little bit more engaging and entertaining. And so I think that those aspects are pretty similar. I think not to get too inside journalism, but I think in terms of the differences, you have to be very careful about your wording, because the stakes are a lot higher when you're writing about legal actions with a lot of liable ramifications. So there was a lot of changing I had to do in those regards, but I would say you'd be blown away at how similar it is to writing to sports in a lot of ways.
Kyle, can you tell us about the first story you either wrote or reported on for Compliance Week?
It's tough to jog the brain. The first one I remember, and it's funny, people mocked me for this, but I stand by it. Obviously, we had the magazine at that point. So the first one I remember is my first story published in the magazine. And that's a special feeling whenever you're published like that in print for the first time, because all my previous experience was digital journalism, which is what we are now and what the majority of media outlets are now. And so the first story that I wrote that was published in print, my father is a big memorabilia collector. He collects things like magazines, and he's a big sports memorabilia collector. Tom, you'd love it. So I, as a Christmas gift to him that year, because it was around that time of year, I got a copy of that magazine, and I took that page, my first published story, and I signed it as if it was a piece of memorabilia for him. And that was the gift I gave him. And again, to most people, that sounds really corny, but my father, I swear, he really loved the gift. So that's the story I tend to associate the most with my being my first story, because I probably wrote some smaller things here or there, but that was my first time I was really published in our print magazine, and it made me kind of feel a lot. But in terms of the story, I mean, like any person, you got to look back on your first stories and you're like, oh man, what the heck was I thinking? It was about data privacy, and it was about how it was a column I wrote. And it was about how consumers, it's hard for this talk and demand and say we want privacy rights when a lot of us just write off our privacy through the apps that we use, through the devices we have in our homes, through the fact that none of us ever read the T's and C's or the privacy policies or anything like that. Although I'm sure some of our compliance officers listening to. So it was kind of a critique of that. But I remember that I started it by with a prompt that I had asked my Amazon Alexa that I had in my house, which I hope I don't set her off right now. But I had asked her, if she cared about my privacy, and she said that she didn't understand the question. And so that's how I had started the piece, was kind of that ambiguity to it. When I look back on it, I'm like, probably not as strong as I thought it was in the moment.
So, one of the joys I have from my position in compliance is watching people and their professional growth. And you made a step that I was convinced you were ready for. I'm not sure you were convinced you were ready for, but you became the editor in chief at Compliance Week. And I was so thrilled for you. But I wanted to ask you, what was it like to move into that role for Kyle?
No, I really appreciate that, Tom. And it was daunting. Like you said at the beginning, there were big shoes to fill. I really give a lot of kudos to Dave for taking a chance on me. It's not often that someone under 30 can hold an editor in chief position. And it was genuinely a risk for him to give me that type of role. But, I had worked with him for so long. He had he knew how much I cared, and he knew how important to me the work was. And he took that chance on me. And I'm forever grateful to it, because these roles are not, they're few and far between, and there's a lot of value placed on them. And you don't quite ever realize it until you're in the role and how much people care about what you say and what you do and all that stuff. And I've always really appreciated the support I've had from the compliance community at large, and the individuals who have connected with me on LinkedIn and networked with me, and we've reached out and talked about it. But it was daunting. I thought like most people, you think what the role's going to be like, and then it throws you a couple curveballs along the way. But the one thing I know for sure that I'm it has been consistent throughout my entire time in the role is that this community has always been so helpful in every way, shape, and form. And it won't be a surprise to anyone listening. That's such a special thing about compliance, that it is so collaborative, and it is really everyone just wants what's best for everyone else. And that's just been such a treat for me to kind of be in this type of role and to feel that pressure, but to have the community say, it's okay, like we understand, and we're here to help you, and we're here to give you genuine feedback and everything like that. And I'm just so grateful for it, because it was really, it's a big risk to take and it's a big step to take. But when you have that sort of support, it just makes it a lot easier.
So, one of the things that I think makes Compliance Week so great is that the editor gets to write a monthly piece, from my perspective, pretty much whatever you want to talk about. And I feel like we've all gotten to know you because some of your most personal writing has been in that role. And so I wanted to ask, were there any that really stand out from that you wrote, or was to some of the pieces you reported on before you became editor in chief really stand out for you?
Yeah, and a lot of that is a byproduct too of like I said, compliance. We have such a small editorial team, and it is all hands on deck. And myself as an editor, and I've been a writer as well. There's a lot of opportunities for me to contribute, and it might be a little atypical. I think most editor in chiefs kind of sit outside of the editorial and just oversee and function. But I like to be part of it just as much as anyone else. And so I've always found that to be really cool. But I think for me, the pieces I tend to enjoy the most are the ones where I feel like I can put together narratives that I've heard from different compliance practitioners, and into a piece that I think kind of gets to a core issue. A lot of that is just from my experience at our events. It's just from my conversations with the compliance officers, just one-on-one, and really helping to inform my view, and then be able to look at something and say, here is what really matters here from a compliance perspective, or here's the lesson that really needs to be learned on behalf of compliance. And so it's hard to think of specific examples because they've kind of come up so much. I'll do one recently. When we talked about it, on maybe our last podcast, writing about the culture scandal that's going on at the FDIC and being able to point to the fact that on their executive board, they have a chief risk officer and they have a general counsel, and yet they are still having the issues that they're having from a culture perspective. And being able to link that to the fact that we are seeing a trend of companies who are consolidating compliance within roles like that. And you're seeing more general counsel and chief compliance officers, or you're seeing chief compliance officers eliminated entirely and their responsibilities being folded into the general counsel. And knowing how that is such a negative to the compliance community and being able to call that out and say, hey, here's a note to companies who are eliminating these compliance roles and thinking their general counsel and chief risk officers can perform those same exact function. Here's an example of an organization, again, the FDIC, like it's an organization like anything else, where there were oversights related to not having that type of role. And so I think I feel like those are pieces that I hold a little bit more value toward, because I feel like that's where I'm really advocating on behalf of this profession in ways that I believe in too. Again, if I'm running a column, it's my opinion, and my opinions are shaped on these conversations that I have with these individuals who I know are, again, constantly under-resourced and feeling that pressure. And I think it's nice to be able to tie that in and be able to say, advocate on behalf of compliance in addition to also really explaining something.
What you say are some of the top stories that Compliance Week covered under your editorship, or maybe just the important stories or your favorites?
Yeah, we've made a handful of changes in my time as editor. One of the things I really started to place a premium on is our unique to Compliance Week content. The things that we are able to produce for our audience that is very specific to them and that they're only going to find on CW. And so we made some changes really in the last year and a half or so to really emphasize that content better and to create more of those opportunities for our writers to emphasize that content. And this was also just reflective of the fact that we knew our readers are busy people. I mean, they don't have all the time in the world to read a 2,000 word epic or anything like that about a $500,000 enforcement action. And we made the conscious decision to de-emphasize the amount of time we put toward our news coverage. Not that we were phoning anything in, but it just kind of really condensed what we were doing from a news perspective to be able to enable our writer to focus more time on speaking with subject matter experts, speaking to compliance officers, speaking to regulators, and getting to the core issues of the problem, and to be able to present those pieces. And I mean, there's so much of it that I really had a lot of pride of, because that was an active choice that I had made and really tried to make based off feedback from our readers and feedback from compliance officers, and just knowing generally what they're looking for. Is, again, it's not something you're really going to find in a press release. It's more of those best practices. And for myself, that's a lot of the pieces that I have pride in. With all of Allison McDevitt's case studies, I've been fortunate to have edited all 5 of her case studies, and each of those are really those deep dives that get to the core compliance issues. Our staff writers, Aaron and Adrian, have also worked to put together pieces like that. I know Aaron's had a multi-part series that he's done on off-channel communications. He did one on whistleblowers. That was a really powerful and compelling series. He did one on ESG at FedEx, and Adrian just recently took the lead with Aaron on a package on child labor and the rising enforcement regarding child labor violations in the U.S. And those type of stories that I really look back on most fondly, just because I think they really get to the core of some of these issues that compliance officers face, and they don't just kind of point to what everyone else is already saying. I think they're really unique, strong pieces for a compliance league audience. And one thing we've tried to really tap into more recently, but we've always had, is that regulator's ear. We know that we have an audience regulators are trying to reach. We know that our audience wants to hear from regulators. And so that's the role we're really trying to lean more into. And so recently we just did a podcast interview with PC Commissioner Hester Perth, where we were really focusing the conversation on CCO liability, resource struggles, and keeping up with all the regulatory change at the S, and what she finds to be most beneficial in her conversations with chief compliance officers. Again, it's content that we know our audience really going to resonate with our audience from a person that's in a position that is very relevant to them and the jobs that they do. And so you take a lot of pride in those type of pieces, because I think that's the role that we're supposed to be playing, is that sort of neutral, independent, body between the compliance officers and the regulators to get the information both ways. We have a big readership among the regulators as well. And that's something that we don't underestimate or devalue, because it's important for them to understand from our writing how compliance officers feel about the issues and the regulatory burdens or whatever it might be.
So, Kyle, one of the things that I think many people think of now when they think of Compliance Week is the inside the mind of the CCO survey and the work you guys do to get the information, the way in sort of October, November, you dole out little nuggets and hints to really get people interested. And then you roll out the entire survey and then really slice and dice it for a good amount of time. But tell us about why that series or why you think that's so important to literally all of us.
Oh, of course. I mean, I think everyone knows how crucial data is to this job, and especially data on ourselves more so than anything else. I mean, as much as it's valuable to have business data, it's also valuable to just have data from the perspective of other compliance officers. And that can be related to business issues, but it can also be related to personal development. And we know how much of a role that plays within this profession, is the idea of being able to progress and take that next step. And so many compliance officers are hungry to do that. And so it's nice to have data to help to inform those choices. And so that's what we really see that survey as providing. And again, a shout out to Dave. It was his idea to launch the Inside the Mind of the CTO survey. I think we did it for the first time back in 2020, I want to say. And it's been true. It's proven to be such a valuable source for us, and it informs our coverage. Again, if we have all this data about the areas that are keeping compliance officers up at night, or how they feel about these changes in regulation, or what areas, or what they feel about AI and all these new technologies, or whatever it might be, we're going to take that into consideration in our coverage, and we're going to make sure that we're trying to provide more information on these areas that compliance officers are indicating to us they're struggling with. And so I think that it becomes such a crucial thing for us. It's something we reference. We do it every year in the winter, but we reference it throughout the year because it really helps to inform our coverage to that point. And I've had a lot of folks, and this is something I take a lot of pride in, who reach out to me looking for that data to use in their reports to their board, or to use in their reports to their own purposes. And so it's great to have that recognition among the compliance community and say, okay, Compliance Week is a great source for this information. Because we do this survey, it's anonymous, independent. It's something we're conducting. There's no sponsorship attached to it. We do it in-house. And you just know that you're getting genuine responses from the people who are taking it. And so it's really valuable data to be able to have that and be able to hear directly from compliance officers what they seem to be the struggle areas. So I think that's something that we'll certainly be continuing to do. And I think it's just going to continue to inform everything that we do moving forward.
Kyle, I'd like to close our podcast time together by talking about some sports. And I've never quite figured out if you're more passionate about the Red Sox or the Celtics. But right now, we're all talking about the Celtics. And you have very passionately explained to us about the expectation of the Celtics in Boston. There is one outcome that is acceptable, and only one, starting in the 60s, all the way through the aughts for the Celtics. The thing I've been thinking about is, and how I feel about the Celtics is, I love Tatum and Brown, but until they win, I'm not going to crown them as the winners. And I sort of hark back to LeBron James. And I can remember when I wasn't sure about LeBron James until in a game 6 in Boston Garden, he one-handedly destroyed the big three and took Miami to the finals that year. And I said, okay, in the Garden, under pressure, he took control. And from that moment forward, I acknowledge him as the man. Is that a fair comparison for Tatum and Brown? They have done spectacularly well over the past 3 years, but you've made clear they haven't won the ring yet. So how do we assess those guys pre-finals?
Yeah, to put your mind at ease and answer your burning question there, Tom, I am a baseball fan first and foremost. That has always been the sport I am most passionate about. But these days, I find myself more passionate about going to bed at 8 p.m. So I don't catch too many games as much as I'd like to. But in Boston, you're just spoiled because all the sports teams are typically compelling. Even when they're bad, there's something that you can't turn away. But to answer your question regarding Tatum and Brown, again, a lot of what I'm saying is not It's an easy opinion to have because it's the same things that they're saying. They hold themselves to a certain standard as well. And again, the Celtics entered this year very much setting the expectation was title or bust. And I think Tatum and Brown were really at the head of that kind of expectation that they were setting for themselves as well. And these are still guys who are relatively young in their career, but they hold themselves to a high standard. And I think that's why they've been as successful as they have been at such a young age and with each other. And so I think that, yeah, it's fair to kind of set that as the bearing is you need to win this title for us to truly buy you as all NBA players or the Celtics stars that stand out within the many star players that have been through Boston. I think they would 100% agree with you. And it's really how you end up playing in those clutch games and in those clutch moments that really defines you as a player. And when, especially in Boston, we talk about some of these role players that have that clutch moment. We still talk about Dave Roberts, like he was the stud all of 2004 when he really just had, not to minimize anything else, but he had that one steal in 2004 ALCS. That's always the way things are really memorized here is how you performed in those clutch moments. And so I think both of them know that. And that's going to be the expectation for them going into this finals against the Dallas Mavericks is how are they able to perform when the chips are down and when someone needs to take the shot, which one of them is that takes it and makes it. And so, I think one of the good things about them is that they're happy to have it be the other person. They are very supportive of each other, but at the end of the day, it's all about getting the win. And so that's going to be the expectation for the Celtics here going into the finals.
Kyle, we are now at the end of our time, but I wanted to end with one final question. Is there any final remarks or final thoughts you want to share with the compliance community since you're going to be leaving us at least for a short time?
Yeah, I think I appreciate the opportunity. It's something, again, I mentioned at the beginning, I've always just been so grateful at how welcoming this community has been to me, especially someone who was, you could say, an outsider because I came in with that sports background. And so many people were just great sources of knowledge to me to really help and make sure that I understood these things from a compliance perspective. And it's not often you get that in a journalism capacity because at the end of the day, you're a journalist and people feel very nervous when they're talking to a journalist. But I think we always had a reputation of trust among this community. And I always really appreciated that. So it's been so great, the support that I've received these last several months. I don't expect that this is the last many of you will hear or see from me. I expect to still be active with my connections, and I'm not quite sure what my career will hold. The reason I'm doing this is to just take a step back and properly reflect on about 11 years spent working in journalism and the pros of it, the cons of it, and where I'm at in my life and what I want to continue doing. And it may very well be that I end up back in a role like this next year, but to do so with a clearer perspective and maybe some better boundaries around myself that I need to set for myself. And it's been great to have a lot of people who have come up to me and shared with me their own experiences in that regard, because I think it's a pretty relatable position to be in. Yeah, I think I would always just say thank you. I've always appreciated it. A special thank you to the Compliance Week Advisory Board and how much they've done for me. A special thank you, obviously, to you, Tom. You were one of the first people I talked to on my first day, and I've learned so much from you. And I'll miss those aspects of it, but I'm glad that I'll still have those connections on LinkedIn or whatever forum it might be, and being able to keep the conversation going. I'm still going to find a lot of the stuff interesting. I'm still going to maybe share my perspectives on some stuff, and I'm still going to be, of course, rooting for Compliance Week. I believe so much in the work that we do and how important it is, and I will continue to support that company as long as I can and really make sure that the product is always what's best for the compliance community and really reflective of the standard that we've set for ourselves.
Kyle, on behalf of the Compliance Podcast Network, I have greatly enjoyed getting to know you, see your progression, see you step into some huge shoes and make it really put your own print on it. So kudos, congratulations, and I can't wait to see the next iteration of Kyle Brasseur.
Thanks, Tom. Always appreciate it.